When you think of youth activists today, who comes to mind? Maybe Greta Thunberg, a climate activist who gained widespread attention at 15 years old? Or maybe Parkland shooting survivors, X Gonzalez and David Hogg? These young activists are pretty well-known figures, and they've got the social media influence to match some of your favorite celebrities. But there are lots of young people doing this work without making headlines. In recent years, we've seen an increase in the visibility of student activists with the rise of social media. Engaging in political activity only on social media, though, is often known as slacktivism. Maybe you follow some people whose activism ends at retweeting. But Jessica Fernandez, a professor who studies youth activism and its relation to social media, sat down with us and explains how this is actually an opportunity to get young people more involved.
I think it's important for us to pay attention to that as adults, as educators, as community members, to tap into the young people who are circulating these forms of performative activism on social media, to really center them in an understanding of what the issues are, and then how they can actually follow up with actions so that it doesn't become hollow.
One study from Tufts University found young Americans are increasingly going offline and taking their activism to the streets. A 2018 poll found that young people ages 18 to 24 were 3 times more likely to have attended a march or demonstration than they were in 2016. The research also found that people who participated in offline activism were more likely to vote. In the 2020 presidential election, young people voted in record numbers. Half of people ages 18 to 29 voted, which was an 11% increase from 2016. While youth activism might look a little different these days, it's not new. Let's take a look back at some of the earlier movements that were led by young folks here in the US. There was the student-led sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, my hometown, in 1960. Young black men who attended local HBCU, North Carolina A&T State University, sat at a whites-only lunch counter and refused to give up their seats. They became known as the Greensboro Four and inspired more sit-ins in college towns across the country. In 1965, students in Iowa were suspended from school when they wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. They sued the school, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In a 7-2 decision, the court sided with the students in Tinker v. Des Moines, saying students have a right to free speech in public schools. In 1968, nearly 20,000 students from the mostly Chicano neighborhood of East LA staged a series of walkouts to protest inequality in public schools. UCLA's Chicano Studies Research Center calls this the first mass protest by Chicano and Chicana people in a major city. It resulted in more bilingual classes, more Mexican-American staff, and improvements to libraries and classrooms. A more recent example, students helped pave the way for deferred action of childhood arrivals, also known as DACA. The United We Dream organization was founded by young American immigrants in 2008, which has helped bring about DACA and combat anti-immigrant policies. Young people of all backgrounds have taken part in sit-ins, walkouts, and a march to the Supreme Court.
It's certainly important for us as adults to create spaces that allow for young people to center their voices and their experiences. They're much more savvy when it comes to using technology and communicating and conveying messages in ways that are accessible, engaging, and informative to a much broader and wider audience.
Like Sarah Mora, who was born in Costa Rica and came to the US at 3 years old. She's a DACA recipient and activist for immigrant rights who was elected co-president of the Women's March Youth Empower at 22.
It's not just for DACA recipients. There's TPS, there's H4, there's refugee status. The mess that the government created has to be fixed. I think there's just like such a misconception about migration.
In the past few years, we've also seen young people protesting gun violence with the student-led March for Our Lives in 2018. Some students there were really young, like Naomi Walder. She planned to walk out at her elementary school to protest gun violence after the Parkland shooting.
My friends and I might still be 11, and we might still be in elementary school, but we know life isn't equal for everyone, and we know what is right and wrong.
And Black Lives Matter has seen a lot of students lead the movement across the country. People like Tondiwe Abdullah have paved the way. She co-founded the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard and was named one of the most influential teens by Time magazine.
This, all of us, are the outcome of years and years of oppression, of violence, of racism, of white supremacy, and we're fed up.
To talk with us about this topic a bit more, we're bringing in Nancy Deutsch. Nancy is a professor at the University of Virginia who studies youth programs and development and has organized conferences on youth activism. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us. I'm curious to know, what are some of the barriers that keep young people from participating in efforts around social justice or political issues?
Yeah, so one thing that we don't always think about with young people is that they actually are not enfranchised, right? In sort of in the ways in which they cannot vote, right? Until they're 18. First, I want to say that it makes youth activism all the more meaningful and important, right? They care enough about our society to engage in a system in which they don't actually have access to other political ways, right, of making their voice heard and known through voting. So that's number one. Number two, I think that while the online space is obviously a space where there is a lot of activism happening, what really I think helps young people take that next step and sort of be able to organize more formally or participate in ways beyond the online space is having support from programs that scaffold them and that provide them with opportunities. So whether that is organizations where there are supportive adults that are both helping them refine their message, helping them learn how to speak in different ways to different audiences, right? How do you go speak with a policymaker versus, activism in the streets? What do those two things, what are the different ways of engaging in those effectively? And so I think that having spaces where young people's voices are heard, are valued, and are amplified is really key.
What do you see for the future of youth activism? What's on the horizon here?
I don't think it's going away anytime soon, and that's a good thing, right? I think that activism is a way that we're actively involved in our democracy and in making change in our democracy and saying, here are the things that we think are important. And if you look at a lot of the issues that young people have been particularly vocal about and involved in activism about recently, so whether it's Black Lives Matter and the racial justice movement, whether it's around gun violence, whether it's around climate activism, these are issues that are having direct, immediate, and long-term effects on young people. And they are going to be living with the consequences of what's happening today. So I think that the future looks like young people continuing to mobilize. And I think as adults sort of help do things like mentoring, right? There's a great approach to mentoring called critical mentoring, which is about how we work with young people to make social change. So rather than thinking about mentoring as just something where adults sort of pass on skills or support youth in skill development, it's really about collaborating with young people around seeing systems and trying to figure out how do we most effectively make change in those systems. And I think that is really going to be a big wave in the future, right? Is youth and adults partnering together to work towards social change.
Nancy Deutsch is a professor at the University of Virginia who studies youth programs and development and has organized conferences on youth activism. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.